So once again, welcome to Politics in Prose. My name is Abby Fenewald. I manage the in-store events here. And tonight we're so happy to have with us Jonathan Darman to discuss his new book, Landslide. So in the book, Mr. Darman, who's a former Newsweek political reporter, has brought into focus two of the giants in 20th century American politics, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. So more specifically, the book chronicles the period following the assassination of President Kennedy, which was a huge period of turmoil and change for the American political landscape. So Reagan and Johnson were obviously opposites in so many ways, but both had, their own clear vision for the future of the country. So just a quick nice quote about the book so far. Historian John Meacham said this: in taking us back to a moment in American history when politics worked, Jonathan Darman provides a resident reality check on a system that now seems all too dysfunctional. So seemed a very appropriate quote tonight here in Washington. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Darman.
Thank you, everyone. I should say at the outset that I grew up right on the other side of the river in McLean, so I'm very happy to be here. I've spent some happy hours in this bookstore, and I'm happy to see some familiar faces in the crowd tonight. I live now in New York City, and specifically in Brooklyn, which means I've been to a few readings, and I know they can be somewhat unwieldy, so I'm just going to read a little bit, but mostly I'm going to talk a little bit to give you a better sense of the book that I've written and the story that I tell. But I will start off with a passage from the very first paragraph of the very first chapter of my book, because I think it sets the stage for some of the themes that I'd like to talk about tonight. And it's from November 23rd, 1963, which, as you probably know, is the day after the Kennedy assassination. At the beginning, the worst part is the uncertainty. Later, after the morning dignitaries have come and gone, after the black crepe has been taken down from the chandeliers and the funeral geldings have been put out to pasture, people will remember this weekend as a time of great sadness. For years and then decades, they'll look back and remember their sorrow. They'll say they knew instantly that life would never be the same again. But that will be memory doing memory's ruthless work, obliterating any discordant details, imposing order where once there was none. In these first hours there is sadness, but mostly there is chaos and the dreadful unknown. What has happened to America, and what is going to happen next? Landslide is the story of the 1,000 days that come after that. And what drew me to the period originally is the effect that feeling of great uncertainty had on our politics in that moment. And I think those questions, what has happened to America and what is going to happen next, are questions that we hear ourselves asking today. And the fact that we feel that same kind of uncertainty has caused a lot of volatility in our own politics. So my hope in looking at this period was to get some answers about how people have grappled with this in the past. And over time, the way that I found to explore the period was through the lives of these two men, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. Johnson and Reagan are not people that we normally think of together. I know that I certainly did not. They are the iconic liberal and conservative presidents from the late 20th century. If you are liberal, you look to the sort of high moment of the Johnson presidency as the moment where ideological passion matches with political opportunity in the country. When Johnson took the oath of office in January of 1965, he spoke to a country that was enthusiastic about the idea of government setting out to solve the greatest problems facing its people, and believed that that was really possible to do it. He said, the programs at his inaugural said, all that has come before in our glorious history is but a prelude to the great society. And people really believed that it was possible to tackle problems in that moment. Flash forward 16 years later to the moment when Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office in 1980. he was speaking to a very different country. It was a country that had lived through the traumas of Vietnam, Watergate, the energy and inflation crises of the 70s, and a series of failed presidencies. And there was a sense in the country that a generation of leaders had failed America in its somewhat sense of predestined greatness. And Reagan spoke to that in his own inaugural, of course, with the memorable line, "In our present crisis, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem." So we think of them as belonging to two very different moments in time. And of course, they're also the two best examples of two different approaches to the presidency. Johnson is the embodiment of a sort of all-encompassing, aggressive, finger in every pot approach to the presidency. Everything that happened in his administration, he wanted to have his hands all over. I've been thinking about a story from his chief legislator, Larry O'Brien, who was a Kennedy aide, who became Johnson's chief legislative strategist for a time, who one night was up on Capitol Hill and was trying to deliver a bill for the presidency and for the president, and came up short. They lost, and it was late at night, so he sort of didn't want to go back and face the reality, and he procrastinated. He went out and got a bite to eat. He stayed up for a few hours, and finally in the morning, he called up Lyndon Johnson to tell him what had happened. And Johnson's first question was, "When did this happen?" And O'Brien told him, he said, "Why didn't you wake me?" And, O'Brien said, and Johnson said, "When you're bleeding up on that hill, I want to be bleeding with you." And that's sort of the heart of Lyndon Johnson's approach to the presidency. That would never be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an actor, and his career in acting, among other things, gave him an appreciation for a good night's sleep. And there were, of course, multiple controversies in the Reagan administration about the president not being awoken for key events. But I think also more broadly, the whole philosophy that Reagan brought to the presidency was that the president should be removed from a lot of the dirty work that goes on in practical politics. He wanted to stand up on a higher plane and sort of set the principles and let others be the ones to sweat the small stuff. So those are two very different approaches. And they're really quite different even in their personal styles. They were both great communicators, but in very different settings. Johnson was famously overwhelming to deal with in person. And people who met him would describe the feeling of sort of having someone look at them as though they were looking deep into their soul. He could understand who they were, what they wanted, what they needed, and go after it. Reagan, people liked being around him in person, but there was, even with the people who were closest to him, his family, there was a certain distance, like he wasn't really connecting with them. Where he really connected best, of course, was in front of a camera, speaking to millions of people that he wouldn't see, and probably would never know. But he was able to communicate with them in a way that made them feel like he understood them. And that was something that Johnson was never able to do. And one of the stories that's in here is about that politics changing in this country, where someone with Johnson's skill set is going to become inevitably disadvantaged to someone who has Reagan's unique ability to speak to the country as it becomes more disconnected from local organizations and more sort of defined by its mass media. So for all these reasons, we're used to thinking of Johnson and Reagan as belonging to two totally different moments and totally different universes. But they were contemporaries. They were born less than 3 years apart. And so what does that mean? That means that they were shaped by the same world events. Their worldviews were shaped by the same world events. They came of age in the same America. They had the same hero in Franklin Roosevelt. And I think what appealed to Roosevelt, in part, what appealed to both of them about Roosevelt was the fact that he was a hero. He was the most famous person in the land, and in a moment of great uncertainty in the country, he was able to capture the country's attention with a compelling vision that people could go behind. And that was something that they both admired, because I think, in the end, the biggest similarity between Johnson and Reagan is their common need, which is to be a hero in a grand story and to feel the eyes of the world on them. You see that very early on in both of their lives. Johnson grew up in the Texas Hill Country, attended a tiny little schoolhouse called the Junction School, and when he was a little kid, he was not reading in class, and they couldn't get him to read. And finally, the teacher determined that he could read, but the only way to get him to read was to take him up in front of all the other students, sit him on his lap, and have him read aloud. And when he was in that schoolhouse, the rule was if you were going to go out to use the bathroom, you had to write your name on the chalkboard. And then, the other kids would write, Billy, Susan, and he would write Lyndon Baines Johnson. So there's a sense that this is a big personality that, people need to watch. And that's true in Reagan's life as well. It's a little harder to spot, but by the time he is a teenager, he is famously spends his summers as a lifeguard, and people over the years have tried to find a lot of meaning in this. Is this sort of symbolic of the role that he sees himself playing for the country later on, watching over and willing to swoop in and save people. But Reagan's own explanation for it was a lot more simple. He said, what the appeal was? Everyone could look at me up on that stand. It was like a stage. And that for him was an incredibly powerful thing. He described when he was in college, at one point there was a student protest and he became a speaker, and he described the feeling that he got that night speaking to the crowd as heady wine. And Lyndon Johnson, I think, would have known exactly what he meant by that. There was nothing that they both wanted more than to feel those eyes on them. And it guided them both throughout in young adult life, into adult life, in their respective careers. For Reagan, of course, that was first that was radio broadcasting, and then acting. And when his movie idol career started to peter out, he went looking for it in other settings. He found a sort of grand position as the president of the Screen Actors Guild. Then he got a job as the host of GE Theater, which at first didn't seem like such a big deal until he realized that it was one of the most popular television shows in the country, and he had millions and millions of eyeballs looking at him every week. And he also, of course, got to travel the country as a spokesman for GE, meeting, hundreds of thousands of people over time who were strangers, and he had to find a way to connect with an audience, and he loved that feeling. Johnson, of course, does it in a much more straightforward way in politics. But even then, his sort of rapid rise is remarkable, even for politicians, in the way that it becomes about getting everyone to remember exactly who Lyndon Johnson is. He describes his courtship of his wife as getting her to focus her mind completely on me, which is what he did with everything. Part of the reason that he was such a powerful Senate majority leader was he had this innovation that the Senate was sort of this institution that was very confusing, and it needed a powerful, dramatic story. So if you make the leader into this compelling, dramatic figure who's doing all this work, you will gain in power because people will pay attention to you. So he was not only, as we know, probably one of the most effective majority leaders in the history of the Senate. He was certainly also the most famous up to that time, probably, at least in the position of majority leader, and how he did it, because he really consciously tried to get everyone to focus their attention on him. A key similarity that I think is so important to the story that I tell here is at the beginning of these 1,000 days I've written about, Johnson and Reagan are both thwarted in their need. Johnson is, in November of 1963, of course, John F. Kennedy's vice president. And as many of you know, that was not a happy period in Lyndon Johnson's life. Having known the heights of power and authority in this city, he, in the Kennedy presidency, was marginalized and very close to power, but completely outside of it, which for Lyndon Johnson is the worst kind of torture. By 1963, he was deeply depressed. He was completely alienated from Kennedy's staff, and there was a lot of talk that he was going to be dropped from Kennedy's ticket in 1964. So he was 55 years old looking toward what he saw as old age. Johnson men, he believed, didn't live past 65. And if he was going to look at the future, it didn't seem like there was another opportunity for him to again know that kind of wonderful acclaim and power that he had always hungered for. Reagan, too, and this was an interesting discovery for me, was thwarted in that need in November of 1963. He, as I mentioned, had found this new calling as sort of a public figure, speaking about public affairs through his career with GE Theater. And it had given him this sort of entree into the world of politics and made him become passionate about the conservative movement and a speaker about politics. But he actually got fired, or he lost his job as the host of GE Theater in 1961. And he, in November of 1963, is 52 years old and sort of wondering what his next act is going to be and if there is going to be one. If you go and ask the famous question of Ronald Reagan, where were you the day that John F. Kennedy was shot? He's somewhere that, at least in the sort of heroic Reagan narrative, he's not supposed to be. He is playing a villain, which he hated doing, in a very dark remake of Ernest Hemingway's The Killers. And he's not even a sort of gallant or capable villain. He's a sort of cowardly and conniving villain. And it was the kind of role that Reagan hated. He always regretted taking the role, but it was the only work he could get. And so part of what I've really tried to do in this story is talk about how the 1,000 days that follow and the great sort of role that uncertainty in the country presents an opportunity for both of these men to take one last shot to sort of step forward and play that role of hero and leader that they've always longed to do. The first one to do it, of course, is Johnson, who is thrust into the presidency by the Kennedy assassination. And his job is to rally the country behind him and to get the country to somehow move on, which sounds to us now, knowing how history worked out, to be a very simple task. It's not. One of the first things that I did when I started researching this period was to go back and look at all that footage from the weekend after John F. Kennedy's assassination, but to try to keep the camera on Johnson, who is the president. And it's actually impossible to do. The pictures that come out of Dallas and then back here in Washington of the Kennedy family and of the Kennedy funeral procession and of the country grieving are so compelling that your attention will always shift away from this man who is the president of the United States. He, in those first days, didn't work out of the Oval Office. He worked out of the Executive Office building, and the cameras, when they would talk about Johnson, would show that building, but they weren't used to filming it, so they didn't have a set position to capture it, and it was just a really bad picture. It was just a gray mass of bricks. So they would, move on to something else that was more compelling to show on television. And that was sort of the reality that Johnson faced. He was in power, but he was not the center of the story. And how to do it, how to retake the story while honoring what the country had just gone through and acknowledging it was a real challenge. And he, of course, finds a way to do it brilliantly by matching his own need to move on with the sense that the country feels of, are things ever going to be okay again? And presenting them with this idea that they can honor JFK's legacy by rallying together and trying to pass the JFK program and rallying together behind him. And the country is so relieved when he presents this idea to him that they thrill to it, and he becomes this incredibly popular figure. So that by about a month into the presidency, he's a hero for the country in a way that he had thought he would never be again. And so I'll just do a little reading from a moment a month after the assassination, and this is from the perspective of Lady Bird Johnson, who is back home on the Texas ranch where they've gone for the LBJ Ranch in Texas, where they've gone for Christmas for a family holiday. Christmas had always been different, a retreat into another time. Typically, Lyndon and Lady Bird and their daughters would open presents and spend the day motoring through the hills of Lyndon's boyhood on the Pedernales River, delivering gifts to friends and relatives. A box of candy here, a bottle of Scotch whiskey there. The plan for Christmas dinner this year was much the same as it had been in years past. 23 family members gathered at the ranch house table. But the old times were gone. Just as the assembled kinfolk were about to sit down to their dinner that afternoon, a large bus appeared outside the ranch house. Out poured a pack of reporters and photographers who had come for a prearranged photo opportunity of the new president celebrating his holiday. For President Johnson, these were the most important guests of the day. He greeted them eagerly and posed happily for the photos dressed in a green plaid jacket. The whole thing was supposed to take a moment. The press pack would get its picture and then return whence it came so that the Johnsons could celebrate the holiday in private. But after posing, the president lingered with the press, introducing his relations. The reporters dutifully wrote down the names. Uncle Huffman Baines, Cousin Oriole Bailey. Lyndon sucked in the attention. Perhaps the reporters would like a tour of the house? Lady Bird looked on warily. Already, she'd agreed to host the press corps for a barbecue in 2 days' time. Honey, she reminded her husband, I promised to give them a wonderful tour when they come back on Friday. The turkey is ready and the dressing is not getting any better. The president would not be deterred. It'll only take a minute, he told her. He beamed at the reporters. Come on in. And so, with the dinner guests waiting, some 50 journalists trailed along behind the president as he led his way through the ranch house. He walked quickly, sharing details of the house's construction, pointing out the paintings of Texas landscapes hanging on the walls. He guided them through the collection of framed photographs, a window on Johnson family greatness. He proudly showed off a letter from Sam Houston, first president of the Republic of Texas, written to one of Lyndon's great-grandfathers. Meanwhile, Lady Bird dashed toward the master bedroom. She knew her husband, and she knew what was coming next. She hurried to lock the door behind her and began preparing the room for outside eyes. Sure enough, in a moment came a knock at the door and the sound of someone fiddling determinedly with the knob. Then came the raised voice of the president. Mrs. Johnson's locked the door on me. She opened the door and smiled as the mob barreled in. The next stop on the tour was the outdoors, where the president held forth on the habits of the 400-acre working ranch and the modern conveniences with which he'd equipped it. Linda, he called to his eldest daughter, do you know where to turn on the muzak? Soon there was dance music blasting from a speaker in a large live oak tree. He was proud of the sophisticated system. We used to dance a lot. Lady Bird watched as her smiling husband made his way through the pack of admiring observers. Her dinner was getting cold and her private peace had been disturbed. But here was her husband, showing off his ranch, talking of great Johnsons past and present. Watching Lyndon perform for a captive audience, this, more than anything, was what Lady Bird knew as home. So that need to perform for a captive audience propels Lyndon Johnson in the years that follow. He, in 1964, summons the country's will behind him and passes the Kennedy tax cut and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He runs against Barry Goldwater in 1964 with the idea almost that a vote for Lyndon Johnson is a vote for things to be okay in America. And the country thrills to this message. He wins in a terrific landslide. And Johnson appears happy in the moment. He says it was the first time in all his life that he'd really truly felt the love of the American people. But of course, it's not enough. He then goes on to set out in the first term that he has won in his own right to surpass the legacy of Kennedy and to rival the legacy of his hero, FDR. He passes the transformative legislation of the Great Society. He passes Medicare and Medicaid, and he, of course, passes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it is this incredibly grand and heroic story. But he also does something different, something in this period, which I think begins to get him into trouble. He starts talking differently about the progressive vision and how problems can be solved in this country. There had been, I think, since the time of FDR, a tradition of true realism in progressivism, which was quite a noble tradition. We think of FDR, of course, as someone who transformed people's relationship with the federal government. But there was also, in FDR's rhetoric, the constant awareness that government was a human pursuit and was thus imperfect. And there's a wonderful tension between the aspirations that we can set for government and our expectations of our own ability to fulfill those expectations. The idea that we will always fall short in our abilities to solve the hardest problems, but we should try nonetheless. And I think that tension was responsible for some quite good government in the presidencies, not just of FDR, but Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and even John F. Kennedy. We think of Kennedy today as an idealist who spoke, of these wonderful possibilities, but that real sense of sacrifice, humility, and realism was quite present in the Kennedy rhetoric. Johnson in 1964, 1965 really dispenses with all that. He gives the country the sense that these problems that he is setting out to tackle can be tackled quite easily and quite quickly. He stands on the White House lawn in December of 1964 and says, "These are the most hopeful times since Christ was born in Bethlehem." And then there's a lot of other stuff. He loved the sort of biblical language, so he would say, it's the time of goodwill on earth and peace among men. Like the place is here and the time is now. So he's really departing with that realistic tradition, and he does it at exactly the wrong moment because reality is about to spin completely out of control. The year 1965 is a year of great legislative triumph for Johnson, but it's also a year in which the country becomes aware that Vietnam is not just a distant place. It is a conflict that is complex and troubled and is going to disrupt potentially hundreds of thousands of American lives. It is the year in which everyone is waiting for the country's cities to explode. And finally they do in a very graphic fashion in Watts in the summer of 1965. And so there is this sense that the reality that people see on their television screens and the way that the president has talked about government's powers are completely out of whack. And people lose faith in his vision, and they do it, I think, a lot more quickly than what they might have expected because of what had been a sort of lurking anxiety that was there all along. And that, I think, is attributable in the period to that same uncertainty that I described before. Where there is potential for tremendous hope, there's also potential for tremendous fear. And people start looking for a new explanation. And a lot of politicians try to sort of quickly position themselves to present the alternative to Johnson. But the one who does it, I think, most vividly in the period and ultimately the most consequentially is Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan has been interested in politics and has been a figure in the conservative movement in 1965 for nearly a decade. And he's been in the conservative movement for nearly a decade. And he's drawn to this realm, but he is at the same time deeply realistic about the sort of broader appeal of the conservative movement. So when people in 1965 start talking about Ronald Reagan as someone who could challenge Pat Brown, the incumbent governor of California, for the governorship, it's at first seen as a joke. The prospects of the Republican Party are so bad that they're talking about this guy, the actor Ronald Reagan, as their best shot of a candidate. But actually, Reagan's acting background makes him in many ways the perfect politician to emerge in this troubled moment of anxiety in the country, because Reagan's training as a product of the studio system has trained him to be completely focused on national mood. Reagan was an actor who was really actually a product of the studio system. In those days, he was in the kind of movies in the 30s and 40s that the studio system would just sort of churn out. And the idea was you found something the public liked, and then you replicated it as quickly and cheaply as you could until the public tired of it, at which point you had to move on to something else. And there was the sense that the public had things they liked, and it would inevitably change. So if you're Ronald Reagan and your livelihood is determined by that public taste, you really develop a sort of reverence for it, and you're very concerned at all times of not being on the wrong side of it. And that makes him a unique figure in the conservative movement in the 60s. In 1964, he's involved in Barry Goldwater's campaign. And Goldwater, of course, has a very bloody primary battle against Nelson Rockefeller in California, which Goldwater ekes out a victory in. And Reagan is a Goldwater supporter and worked in that campaign. But after the campaign is over, he stands up and he says, let's go, as he puts it, make love to Democrats. We don't want to win a convention. We want to win an election. And the response from the crowd is boos. And that sort of was a preview of things, coming attractions for the Goldwater campaign in 1964. Reagan was not, in that they were very much all about sort of, bringing their message to the country and not making it sound more palatable. Reagan was always focused on how is this going to play to a wider audience. And so when he then enters politics himself, that's what his focus is on. He actually goes out and hires Rockefeller's, the campaign team that had run Rockefeller's California primary campaign to run his campaign, his unofficial campaign in 1965. And he says, he makes a big deal of saying, I'll only accept the nomination if I'm convinced that I can run as a unity candidate, which does a couple of things. It sort of signals to moderates in the Republican Party that he's going to be answering to them, and he's also sort of signaling to conservatives, don't do anything that's going to make me unelectable to a broader group. And so what he's able to do is spend this time really not talking about sort of his laundry list of conservative issues, but speaking to this growing sense of alienation people feel from the government in Washington, and saying, when talking about Pat Brown in California, all these promises are being made, and they're not coming to pass. And he says he's going to, go in there and be a law and order governor who's going to restore some sanity to California by reining in this big behemoth, which is government. And it has a great appeal. The Democrats don't see it coming. Brown at first actually wants Reagan to be his opponent because he thinks he'll be an easy target rather than Reagan's primary opponent, who is a liberal Republican named George Christopher. And so then when Reagan wins his primary and all of a sudden becomes the biggest political story in the country, they're all taken completely aback. Lyndon Johnson, calls up Pat Brown and tells him, you got to get, perk up, get bushy-tailed. We're going to go after this guy and we're going to hang Goldwater around his neck. But it's way too late to do that, because all that Reagan's been doing over the prior year is proving again and again and again to the people of California that he's not Goldwater. And by then, he has established himself as a thoroughly mainstream candidate who can then go on to defeat Brown by nearly 1 million votes in that election, the midterm election year of 1966, which was also a terrible year for Lyndon Johnson. It was the year that he lost, essentially, his progressive majority in the House of Representatives, which had allowed him to pass all that transformative legislation before. And people saw it as the first sort of rejection of the Johnsonian vision and the Johnsonian record. And a person who was urging people to see it as exactly such was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan says, when asked, that he thinks that the results of the election need to be seen as a rejection by the people of the Great Society. Soon after being elected governor of California, Reagan starts thinking about running for the presidency in 1968. He assumes at that point that he's going to be running against Johnson in Washington, and he keeps sort of a record focused on proving all the things that the Great Society has failed to deliver. Johnson, of course, doesn't run in 1968. Reagan doesn't end up running as the candidate either, but Reagan really keeps running through the 70s against that same idea, the failures of the Great Society, and it animates his political life all the way until he wins the White House in 1980 and even beyond. In a moment of frustration in the White House, he'll write, people think I'm trying to roll back the New Deal. What I'm really trying to do is roll back the Great Society. And so we have, I think, these two really consequential presidencies that are in many ways in dialogue with one another. A lot of what Reagan saw himself as doing in the 80s was work that was unfinished that he had started in the 1960s, is trying to end this, to provide an alternative to this vision of government as the answer to all problems. And I think that over time, that divide has helped to create some of the problems that we have today in our politics, because that conversation changes from what I had talked about in the consensus politics version, from instead being about government is flawed, but how do we make it work, to is government the solution to all problems, or is government the problem? We have essentially allowed our politicians off the hook. They can step forward and say that they believe in one side or the other, at the same time as we actually expect them to deal with government as it really is. So the way that they talk about government is totally different from the reality that even they encounter. And I think that was certainly true in the Johnson and Reagan presidencies. So I talk about that at the end of the book, and I hope that people will read the story that comes before it, and my hope in that is to get people thinking about really how this period creates some of the problems that we have today. But even no matter what you think, I think you can read this story and understand how the lives of these two men are so linked over a number of decades. And just to illustrate that point, I'll close with a little vignette from the end of the book. This is in 1988, more than a decade and a half after Lyndon Johnson has died, when his widow, Lady Bird, goes to the White House. In 1988, she was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the two highest civilian honors the United States bestows, in a ceremony at the White House. Presenting her with the award on behalf of the United States Congress, President Ronald Reagan was generous and warm. "I remember one story," said Reagan, "of the time that LBJ was speaking to a group in North Carolina, and after about 50 minutes, the audience became restless. Lady Bird wrote a note on a piece of paper saying, 'Close soon,' and slipped it to him. LBJ took it, held it up, and read it aloud to the audience. And then, after the laughter died down, he continued with his speech." Reagan paused, taking in some laughter of his own. Then he continued, "Well, before someone hands me a note, I will close these remarks." And I will follow Reagan's example, and I will welcome any questions that you have.
So if you do have questions, please feel free to come to our two microphones here on the side.
What was Reagan's reaction to the Nixon presidency?
So the Nixon is a sort of lurking figure in these pages as well. He is starting in 1964. He is in the 1964 campaign. He's the candidate that Johnson actually fears. He is, which makes sense because the sort of whole subliminal message of Johnson's campaign in 1964 is let's not rock the boat. We want stability and continuity after this trauma of the Kennedy assassination. And when you're running against Barry Goldwater, that means obviously you vote for Lyndon Johnson. But if you were running against Richard Nixon in 1964, that is a much more dicey proposition, because Nixon looks like continuity and stability. He had been the vice president of the United States. He'd come this close to winning the presidency in 1960. So Johnson is focused on Nixon in 1964 as the threat that he sees. And then in the 1966 election, of course, which I write about, is the year in which Nixon makes his very public, stunning comeback, traveling the country on behalf of Republican candidates. And he and Reagan have this sort of friendly but wary rapport with one another in that campaign, in that Nixon understands that Reagan is from California and has this connection with the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party. And so if Nixon's going to run in 1968, he doesn't want to have Reagan controlling this wing and potentially either taking a swing at the nomination himself or delivering it to someone else. So he's pretty fawning and obsequious toward Ronald Reagan in 1966. Reagan then sort of does this uncharacteristically indelicate dance in considering whether he's going to run for the presidency in 1968. And he sort of, in the end, convinces himself that he didn't really put himself forward as a candidate in 1968, even though everyone thought that he did. And Nixon just completely wallops him in the nominating process because he's been laser focused on buttoning up the Goldwater wing, which is Reagan's base. And then if you look at the Nixon presidency, it is in many ways much closer to the Johnson vision than to the Reagan one. And you have, because there is, certainly the same political coalition as Reagan, but there is this idea that, you can do big things through government. Nixon's, one of Nixon's preferred successors, in fact, is John Connally, who had been LBJ's aide. So there's an interesting alternative history if Watergate never happens. You certainly probably don't have the Reagan turn. What actually happens is Watergate does happen, and even though it's a crisis for the Republican Party, it creates an opportunity for Reagan, not just because there's no clear frontrunner and leader in the party, but it plays right into the message that he's been saying of we can't put all our faith in Washington. Look at what Washington has done. So I think the reality of what Reagan thinks of the Nixon presidency is he certainly is disturbed by what's happening in foreign policy, and that he's much more, wants a much more direct confrontation. He would say probably in the 70s that he was opposed to a lot of the government programs pursued by the Nixon administration, but actually it's not that different from the Reagan approach to governing, which is you state your broad principles in opposition to communism, and then you're willing to make deals on everything else. And in the end, that's what guides a lot of the Reagan presidency itself.
I only had a chance to thumb through your book before the program and didn't see Arthur Goldberg's name in the index. Do you talk about the Johnson judicial nominations, which is where I thought the wheels really came off the cart in this administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's focused. That to me speaks to the focus on following the FDR model. Johnson is convinced that what got FDR into trouble was the sort of reactionary Supreme Court. So he's focused on getting his people onto the Supreme Court with most memorably Abe Fortas, so that he can prevent the Supreme Court from taking the same strike at the Great Society. And to me, I think that sort of reflects the same problem of failing to think of what's going on in the country beyond Washington, and not understanding the difference between the Congress and the country. Which, when you think about Johnson's background as a legislator, so much of it is understanding different parts of the country as who they're represented by. But in the 1960s, when you have people having moved out in the prior decade into the suburbs who are not affiliated with big city organizations in the same way, and they don't have the same, just sort of tribal allegiances that people had earlier in the century, you have to think much more about what are the big messages that people in the broad middle class are getting. And so I think that the sort of amount of maneuvering that goes into the judicial process is reflective of a broader sort of focus on everything being about the process and not about the message. Yeah.
I have a question. The moral majority, I don't know if you go into it in the book, but it seems to me that during the Reagan first term, he successfully was able to harness a lot of people you still see in Washington representing various groups into behind his campaign. And so my question is this such a new phenomena as opposed to would this have occurred during Johnson's presidency? What was the influence of particularly the religious, what we consider the religious right, for lack of a better way of putting it, in that process? And do you think that Reagan was as committed to them as some people think he was in terms of bringing him on board?
No, I mean, I think, one of the things that you see when people are looking at Ronald Reagan in the mid-1960s is he is someone who cares passionately about the communist threat. He's really just animated by that and this sense that you have this government in Washington that is appeasing it, and there should be a direct confrontation, and that it presents an existential threat to the country. And that's really what he cares about as a conservative, and everything else, he starts out agreeing with the position, but is really much more willing to move away and doesn't care nearly as much. And so I think that's particularly true in the 80s. The moral majority was present in the sort of grassroots in the 60s in these campaigns, but they weren't they weren't completely wedded in the way that they become in the 80s coalition. So it was possible to be a conservative candidate without being someone who was passionate about those causes. And I think, though, that when you see in the Reagan presidency, you see that sort of he's willing to talk the talk, but it's not what he's really focused on delivering. He's really focused on ending the Cold War and being this sort of symbol of a return to greatness in the country.
When he was governor, when he ran for governor, was that part of his political equation in terms of getting support? Because I know he lambasted the student movements and anti-war protest and all that. That was part of his.
Yeah, I think there was certainly a sense of a political. Reagan liked to see himself as representative of all that was good and normal about the country. In his early Hollywood career, he presented himself. There was some studio propaganda where he says, "Call me Mr. Norm," and so he likes to view himself as sort of the embodiment of everything that's in the American middle. But he doesn't get animated by social religious issues in a way, and they don't have a determinative role in the process in the way that they come in the late 1970s and that they still do today. They're much more animated by a sort of their own passionate anti-communism and a sense of moral decay, more broadly speaking, in this country in terms of what's happening with the nation's youth, with the sort of decay in standards of basic law and order and decency.
Great, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for a really mesmerizing presentation about men shaping events. And I'm thinking more about how the events shape the men. And in Johnson's case, of course, it's Vietnam, civil rights, and the social revolution. And you just spoke about how the fierce anti-communism was a event with shaping Reagan. And I think there's a notion of kind of anti-civil rights that shaped Reagan and his presidency also. But what other momentous events would shape the Reagan presidency in your notion?
So I should say that the book is not about the Reagan presidency, although I hope that people will get a different understanding of the Reagan presidency from reading it. But obviously that sense in the Reagan presidency that the country had lost its way, that it had gone through this series of crises in the 70s, and that it had sort of surrendered its predestined position of greatness was a big animating thing that Ronald Reagan believed and spoke to in the country. And so then he was, and obviously the Cold War buildup was the central guiding principle of the Reagan presidency. I can talk to you about the Johnson presidency and how events really take hold of that presidency as well.
Yeah, say more about that, because it seems to me that both Vietnam, civil rights, and the social revolution were a great impact on the Johnson presidency.
Certainly.
So much so that it curtailed it or ended the presidency, if you will.
Well, so let's go. For Vietnam, it was really interesting for me. I think before I started working on this, I had always put Vietnam and the domestic presidency of Lyndon Johnson almost in two totally different realms, because Vietnam is an example of, in so many ways, of government failure, And when we look at the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act, we see really government at its best. And that was certainly the way that Johnson, at the end of his life, wanted people to think of it, that the Great Society had been his passion, the thing that he really completely was focused on, and then this fate of Vietnam was forced upon him, which in the end distracted him from fulfilling the work that he had set out to do. The reality, I think, is that you really can't separate them nearly as much because, of course, the big push for the Great Society legislation comes at exactly the moment when Johnson is making the fateful decisions to Americanize the war in Vietnam. And I think that they were completely interlocked in Johnson's mind in that period. He thought that he was, essentially a Cold War politician, and the logic there was if you're going to pursue a progressive program at home, you'd better be as tough as you show that you're tough on communism abroad. And so really the sort of scale of his ambitions domestically provides him with an excuse to sort of keep escalating the war in Vietnam, and go along despite these grave doubts that he has, because he has a sort of strong rationale to do it. He wants to do these big things at home, and he can't risk it. And in the end, it works the other way around. He can then say, in response to people who point out the failures of the Great Society, that he the only problem was that he didn't have enough time. He was so distracted by Vietnam that he couldn't focus on making sure that these programs actually worked. So that's true in one way. The other thing I would say, when you talk about events, there's a real difference in the way that Johnson communicates, I think, about civil rights from the way that he communicates about the rest of the domestic agenda. And I think that is in part because it's a much more real thing for him. That moment, the famous speech that he makes after Bloody Sunday in March of 1965, which creates this sort of catalytic effect to pass the Voting Rights Act, is so different. It's almost a different person. The Lyndon Johnson who speaks that night and memorably, echoes the words of the protesters saying, "We shall overcome," is a completely different president from the one who's out there saying all these very gauzy things about, this grand future and the time of peace on earth that's there. And I think it's because he understands from his own experience that civil rights is challenging, that it is a cause that is difficult and a cause that is, he believes at that point, just. And what makes that speech so powerful is he's able to speak from his own experience as someone who had taught Mexican workers in Catala, Texas. So there's just this complete sort of different quality to the way that he thinks about it from the way that he thinks about everything else, which is really as legislation that he's passing. And that to me is a moment where you really see events breaking through a bunch of warring fogs in Johnson's, that's an interesting metaphor, the fog that is in Johnson's head to sort of bring him to a reality, and he speaks to the country quite memorably. And it's tragic that he's not able to do that on so many other things. I think he would have had a lot more success and ultimately if he had trusted the country to speak to them in that same kind of frankness.
Fascinating.
At an earlier period in 1948, it's my impression that Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan had rather opposite positions in the sense that Johnson was more of a Cold War liberal than Reagan. The Americans for Democratic Action was a big new organization in 1948, militantly anti-communist, but liberal left. I ran across a copy of the ADA World, that's the Americans for Democratic Action newspaper, in the summer of 1948, saying, "Today's ADA leaders," and there were 4 pictures across the top: Leon Kaiserling, Chester Bowles, Hubert Humphrey, and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And Reagan campaigned for Truman and Humphrey in Minneapolis in 1948.
Exactly. Yeah.
Johnson was not that much of an ADA liberal.
No.
How do you explain the cross-cutting effects of this?
It's I do go into that in the book, and I would it's a great point. There is this moment in 1948 where Reagan is appearing talking about Hubert Humphrey, the mayor of Minneapolis, as someone who's willing to stand up to the forces of corrupt big business. Reagan's ideological journey is interesting. He talks about it later on as, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me, which, because he had been until actually 1962 officially a Democrat. That was a phrase that resonated with a lot of people because it seemed to reflect the Reagan Democrats' own experience, this idea that they stayed in exactly the same place and the party moved away. In Reagan's case, that really wasn't the journey. He was someone who liked clear, vivid drama and clear distinctions. So when he was a liberal, he was a pretty strong partisan liberal, and was drawn to sort of certainly the left edge of New Deal consensus. When he becomes a conservative, he's drawn to the right edge, because that's where the sort of drama is the line can be most closely drawn. He is animated starting in the 1940s by his opposition to nuclear weapons, which then becomes concurrent with his fear of a communist conspiracy. And it's got all these sort of complicated interpersonal things, in that he's been involved in all these leftist organizations in Hollywood that are potentially have communist membership, and he becomes sort of concerned that there is a communist infiltration and a conspiracy. And Reagan is someone who is drawn to conspiracy theories, which makes sense if you think about that same notion that he has of he's like everyone else and most people are decent and normal and good. The only way that there could be bad policy is if there is a conspiracy to fool them. So he's really drawn to that conspiracy, and that inevitably takes him over to the right. And he still is. He has a sort of conflicted position in the 1950s, but by the latter part of the decade, he's very much clearly in the Republican Party. In the 1960 campaign, Richard Nixon, he wants to help Richard Nixon, and Reagan wants to become a Republican, and Nixon says, no, stay a Democrat because you're more effective as a Democrat. To me, and so it's really this sort of, he's a Democrat in the late 50s and early 1960s, and there's a sort of fake dramatic moment where a woman stands up in a crowd in 1962 and says, I'm a registrar, I can make you a member of the Republican Party, and he says, okay. This is a sort of conversion moment, but it had really been much more longer in the works. But I see the sort of you explain the shift by saying, where is the place where his natural need to draw a dramatic line is gonna feel the most answered. Johnson's journey in that period is, so when he had entered the Senate, and he was trying to survive or to thrive in a body that was dominated by conservative reactionaries, and especially those were his mentors. So in the late 1940s, Lyndon Johnson is really trying to get his stripes as appeasing the red baiters and the segregationists. He then, as his national aspirations grow and he starts to think about the presidency, moves in the other direction on civil rights. And it's, we talk a lot about with politicians in terms of what's genuine and what's opportunistic, but there really is especially in someone like Lyndon Johnson, who is a pure political animal, there's what's in his own self-interest is what he genuinely believes. So I think that conversion really does happen, so that by the time he speaks to the nation in 1965 in that memorable fashion, it's a passionate and real belief. But it's a great point. These if you go back 20 years in time with these two men, they're in two very different places as well.
during the time that you cover in your book or afterwards, were Johnson and Reagan ever in the same room together?
Yes.
And what was that like?
In not a particularly exciting fashion. So they were Reagan, once he becomes governor of California, is of course invited, as all governors are, periodically to functions at the White House. So they met in those settings. There's a great photo at the end of the book of Reagan and Johnson and Richard Nixon in 1969, after Johnson has left the White House, going to dedicate a redwood forest in Northern California, for which Lady Bird Johnson had been involved in. And when you read about that trip, that all these, you had 3 presidents on, it's amazing because Nixon is completely focused on Johnson, who was his predecessor, and making him feel comfortable and warm. And Reagan's just sort of along for the ride. And you'll see, if you look in the photo, like Reagan's just sort of peeking out like this. and it's this, again, a view of an alternate history, that even then, Lyndon Johnson would not know that that's the guy who's going to, in a lot of ways, have the most consequential effect on the sort of long-term viability of a lot of the things that he tried to accomplish. And there's another sort of great moment, I think, in the book, where Reagan has been so focused on this sort of threat that he sees from Johnson's administration in Washington throughout the period that I talk about. Johnson is completely oblivious to Reagan, is not the kind of threat he's focused on. He's much more focused on interpersonal stuff like Bobby Kennedy or Nixon. Finally, there's that moment when Reagan comes out of nowhere and wins in Johnson's mind, and wins the primary, and all of a sudden is the biggest political story in the country, and it's because it's a great story. He's this actor. He's very telegenic, and it's excuse for people to go out to California and write political stories, and so all of a sudden Johnson has to grapple with that, and he's just struggling to catch up. So all of a sudden Reagan is on his radar screen in a big way.